Hi, everybody. So apparently, despite the fact that we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and the fact that my country, the United States, is currently dealing with the increasing authoritarianism of our president, as well as the brutal use of police force on peaceful protesters who are protesting, brutal police force, while the media, police, and government are trying to push the narrative that these are outside agitators, and not to mention all the other horrible stuff happening in the world, all over the world, and not to mention, there's just a lot. There's a lot going on right now. But in the middle of all of this, one JK Rowling, the author of the famous Harry Potter series, decided that this was the moment, this right now was the moment to go full-bore TERF and once again attack transgender people on Twitter. Now, as you can tell probably by the tone that I'm giving off right now, I'm a little bit teed off, but I'm going to try and keep this calm and informative because I want this video to be a discussion on why JK Rowling's views are intensely hurtful and harmful to transgender people and women in general, not just trans women or cis women, just women in general. Let's start this by reading JK Rowling's tweets out loud that were posted today, the day that I'm filming this, June 6th, 2020. Keep in mind that these aren't the first tweets that JK has done that have alluded to this type of viewpoint from her, but these are the most direct on the subject, instead of just her inference of support or direct support for people who share these views.
I've spent so much of the last 3 years reading books, blogs, and scientific papers by trans people, medics, and gender specialists. I know exactly what the distinction is. Never assume that because someone thinks differently, they have no knowledge. If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. People who menstruate. There sure used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Womben? Wimpund? Wombmud?
Okay, so I can totally 100% understand how many of you out there who are not as embroiled in transgender issues might actually look at those tweets and be confused by how they're transphobic at all. I mean, of course, sex exists. We all acknowledge this, even, gasp, trans people acknowledging that sex is a thing? Yeah, that's right. And pretty much every trans person totally knows that sex exists, even though there's a lot of propaganda that says we're trying to destroy all of sex. I know, it's crazy, right? I wish we could do that, but we are not that powerful. And we're even the first to acknowledge that sex exists. For example, while I haven't had genetic testing to 100% confirm this, I'll acknowledge that I most likely have XY chromosomes, those most typically associated with male sex characteristics. So, how in heaven is saying something like, sex is real, transphobic, you might be asking? Well, first off, that's not entirely what JK Rowling is saying here, and it's all about the context in which JK Rowling is discussing this, and what words she uses to state her viewpoints. But to understand all of this, we need to first understand the idea of TERFs, or trans exclusionary radical feminists. Now, I've talked about TERFs in many videos, but I will give a discussion of them here for all of you who may just happen upon this video being your first video on this channel, and I'll just give a brief discussion on them. Brief being a, not a hard and fast word, but a discussion on TERFs. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists, sometimes known as gender-critical feminists, that's what they call themselves because they argue TERF is a slur, despite it being a perfectly apt description of what they are a group that espouses transphobic sentiments, often teaming up with conservative groups to express these ideas. But as conservative and right-wing groups often do, gender-critical feminists hide their statements in wording that is meant to mask their true intentions and incite anger and otherize different groups in order to galvanize those inside their group. Now, how TERFs otherize trans people is actually annoyingly complicated, and like I said, I'm going to break it down here. Basically, TERFs start from a point that, again, we all acknowledge, the aforementioned fact that sex exists. Typically, we define this as someone having XY chromosomes, and thus typically portraying male features, and XX chromosomes for those who have female sex characteristics. But this is a binary viewpoint that often forgets that intersex people exist, or that, even within XY and XX chromosomes, there are many other things that are determined by other part of your genetics, like you can have broad shoulders if you have XX chromosomes, regardless of if you're, have female sex characteristics or male sex characteristics. But sadly, we are going to have to put all that aside for the moment to get to the real meat of this matter. But I just want to let you know, all intersex people out there, I do see you and hear you, so I just want to make sure I acknowledge that. However, TERFs then take this idea of acknowledging the basics of sex that we all know even further. Basically, gender-critical feminism, at its core, opposes the self-definition of trans people, that a trans woman identifies like myself as a woman or a trans man identifies as a man, arguing that anyone that was born with a vagina, again, born with a vagina, is its own oppressed sex class, while anyone born with a penis is automatically an oppressor. Basically, if you're born with quote XY chromosomes, again, that is not 100% always true, you're a man. Basically, if you're born with a penis, you're a man, and you'll always be a man, and also you will always be an oppressor. That's an important note there. And again, the opposite is true. If you're born with XX chromosomes, quote unquote there, you're a woman, and always oppressed, no matter what, definitive. Now, again, if we don't really dive into that, if we just kind of gloss over that, on its face, that seems to make sense. Hell, I'm the first to acknowledge that I probably have XY chromosomes, and that one led me to have been born with male-identified sex characteristics like growing a penis or growing more facial hair. I meant to say having a penis, but I said growing a penis because I misread my script there, but having a penis and growing a facial hair or having broader shoulders. And two, it led me to be raised and seen as a man as I grew up, which tended me to, have certain tendencies like maybe I'll be more aggressive when I'm angry, things like that. That's just how I was raised and taught. And it is true that in most Western societies that are patriarchal, which is pretty much, if not all of them, women are an oppressed class, having too often to fight for equal pay or against sexism in the workplace, to name two of the main examples that a lot of people cite. And we all agree on this. But the issue comes in that TERFs regimentedly and inflexibly define these roles to the point of ignoring facts and ideas simply to target trans people. For example, we can, just automatically, we can already say gender-based discrimination can be imposed upon a range of people, like, for example, gay men who are more effeminate in their actions. But more acutely, TERFs use these regimented sex definitions, as I said before, to attack trans people. TERFs state that trans women don't exist, but are just men who have fetishized womanhood so much to the point of wanting to be a woman. Because again, to them, you are born a man, you will always be a man. And again, being born a man means having a penis. They also say that trans women can't face discrimination as a woman because they're just men who have male privilege no matter what, because again, if you're a man, you can't be oppressed. And on top of all of this, they also say that trans women actively harm women, such as, for example, one they most often use is whenever a trans woman has sex with a woman, they're apparently a rapist because they're lying to the woman that they're sleeping with about being, quote, a man. Because again, if you're born with a penis, you're always going to be the oppressor. Now, all of these things also go towards trans men. I've been using trans men as an example because that's who I am, but it all goes to trans men as well, who are seen by TERFs as simply women who have been brainwashed into wanting to escape being an oppressed class by trying to obtain male privilege and heterosexuality if they like women, instead of fighting back against the oppressors, against men. Now, again, while all of this has small kernels of truth, like, again, cis men typically being ones that are most privileged in a society and often, contributing to the oppression of women, trans or not, this is mostly patently untrue. Again, I am the first to admit my chromosomes, but it is also true that much of what we define as womanhood is social and cultural, not biological. I've done videos on that before, so I'll link that hopefully here, but down below. But again, while I acknowledge that I am privileged for being white, I have personally faced sexism and discrimination for being and presenting as a woman, both during and post-transition, and have also faced discrimination for being transgender on top of all of that, even back before I transitioned. And there are many more who have faced the same, or even worse than I have. In fact, there's a lot of trans women, especially trans women of color, who have faced much worse than I am for being trans and for being women. And by no means am I a rapist simply because I'm trans and slept with a woman or a man for that matter. That's just patently ridiculous and gross and offensive on its face. But these are all things that gender-critical feminists espouse, and even more so, they are militant about it. They have actively called for casting out trans women from women's shelters, for example, places that trans women need to go to and are often the ones that most need to use women's shelters because they are almost always the ones most discriminated against in a group. But kick them out because they're trans women and they're going to appropriate women's spaces. They also discriminate against and insult trans people in the workplace and public spaces and repeatedly misgender trans people actively and go out of their way to do so. And as I've talked about in another video, that is a way of actively dehumanizing somebody and actively hurts the mental health of trans people, which again directly leads to the increase in suicidality rate of trans people. So misgendering people and the way that they hurt trans people is actively harmful, even in the smallest of ways, even just misgendering us. But again, they do it militantly and actively over and over again. I myself have been on Twitter and getting harassed by TERFs who just constantly call me he and sir and insult me just for being trans, not having done anything other than that. TERFs also often point to specific incidents of trans people being horrible to justify hatred against all trans people. Such is the case with Karen White, a trans woman who was in a prison who allegedly raped several fellow prisoners in her women's prison. And I agree, White is a detestable person, and all people, including trans people, find her actions horrible. Yet this one case does not define all trans people, and to say that this one person doing one horrible thing defines all trans people is incredibly horrible, and again, another dehumanizing tactic. To say that an entire group of people are bad because specific people are bad in a group. It's about as dumb as me saying all dogs are horrible just because I had to sit through the recent Scoob movie. Just because that movie was bad does not mean that all dogs are bad. In fact, they're very good boys. You're a very good doggy. It's just incredibly dumb and an age-old vilification tactic used by any group attempting to dehumanize people. And TERFs exist in many places in Western society, but are incredibly active in the UK, where JK Rowling lives, and in UK academia specifically, and they have actively harmed trans people by siding with anti-trans right-wing groups and figures in order to limit the rights of trans people. Again, in the UK, and a little bit in the US, though they have a little less sway here. Keep in mind that they side with right-wing groups against trans people despite many right-wing groups attacking women's rights in general, such as the access to abortion right. Because for TERFs, the point is not to fight for women's rights, but to attack transgender people. That is the point of being a TERF, in order to make themselves feel powerful and in control in a world that sadly does treat women, and specifically lesbians, and most TERFs are lesbians, like crap. I understand it. I understand why feeling like the victim makes you want to lash out, and sometimes you lash out people below you, but being part of a vulnerable group does not allow you to harm those who are even more vulnerable than you. As you can probably tell, I am very, very upset and angry, so I'm going to take a minute to just breathe. Okay. So that's basically the basics of TERF ideology. If you want to know more, like the history of TERFs and more on about their ideology, there's a wonderful Vox article that pretty much goes over a lot of things that I've linked down below that goes into much, much more detail. But let's get back to JK Rowling specifically. I hope my hair isn't all messed up. Oh my gosh. Angry Jessie has bad hair days. JK Rowling and her tweets are right in line with TERF ideology, as outlined above, not to mention that she has retweeted and publicly supported noted TERFs who were so bad that they were even convicted in UK court for their continued and active discrimination against trans women, but I've talked about that in other videos. But her tweets here also show how incredibly thoughtless and limiting TERF ideology is. As JK Rowling states,
if sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth.
There's this simply, honestly, just dumb narrative that by simply acknowledging that trans women exist and can exist as women in women's spaces somehow completely erases all other women's struggles, that we somehow override everybody. Again, you don't just see that in TERF's ideas, but you see this in things like, with people like Ben Shapiro, saying that if we acknowledge trans people, we're somehow destroying the scientific idea of sex.
To dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are.
As if my doctor isn't completely aware of my medical history as a trans person, isn't completely aware of me being XY, or isn't completely aware that I am a trans person and the specific needs therein, or somehow that scientists will somehow forget that genes are a thing because, oh, trans people exist, that I'm so confused, XY, XX chromosomes, oh, we're so confused that we can't, science anymore. How silly and dumb is that? I wish we had that power. I wish we could just make it all about us, but no. We just want to say, hey, just letting you know, hi, we're here. Don't just try, maybe we should just try and find ways to make us all feel comfortable instead of, just a specific part of us. But no, we're somehow overriding everybody's conversation. Acknowledging trans women and the fact that trans women exist alongside women does not hurt women. In fact, it strengthens women, showing that we can be a diverse coalition that works together for all of our rights. Just because a trans woman may not be able to get pregnant doesn't mean that we don't care about abortion rights, or that we can't talk about abortion rights even if we acknowledge that trans women are also in this space with us. It doesn't have to be a one or the other thing. And by the way, I and many trans women still fight alongside our friends who need access to women's abortions and health care. And we always have. There's a history of trans people fighting for women's rights regardless of whether they apply to us or not. Just as we ask women, who many do by the way, to help us in our fights for our own healthcare and transgender rights. There are many battlefields and fights, and acknowledging that there are many avenues that we all need to fight for, and other people besides ourselves that we need to fight for who may share similar identities to us, does not hurt your own fight. It just strengthens yourself and your allies who fight alongside you. But TERFs don't see it that way. They do things like what JK Rowling also states in this tweet.
People who menstruate. There sure used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Womben? Wimpund? Wombud?
You'd think the woman who came up with the Harry Potter books would at least be better at coming up with silly names. Oh, menstruation. Again, how dumb is this? Because you clearly know that she is saying that the word woman is synonymous with people who menstruate. Which, by the way, it isn't, even if we forget trans people. There are many cisgender, i.e. non-transgender women who don't menstruate. Either because they were born not being able to menstruate because of a myriad of different disorders or things like that, and genetics or things like that, or even have gone through menopause and don't menstruate anymore. Would you somehow say that these women, many of whom aren't trans by the way, are somehow less trans? It also doesn't acknowledge trans men who may still menstruate despite not being women. And JK Rowling's getting so upset about the word women. It's like, why don't we just use the word women? I think we do. We often talk about women's rights. Quite often, I'm doing it right now, even though I'm talking about TERFs. But saying the word people who menstruate is much more accurate. It allows you to be much more specific, and specificity in your words is the entire point of being a writer, something JK Rowling should know. For example, I'll use, a completely different example that doesn't have anything to do with gender or anything like that. We used to call the term for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it used to be called simply shell shock. The term shell shock, which was PTSD, by the way, was a term that came up after World War I, I believe, not World War II, I believe World War I, to talk about, soldiers who were dealing with PTSD. But a lot of people just said the word shell shock was like, oh, because they got all crazy because they were near shells and they heard loud noises and that's why they have PTSD. But over time, the word has evolved, the definition has evolved because we have a greater understanding of what it is, eventually coming to the word post-traumatic stress disorder and applying it more accurately than the word shell shock ever did. Words evolve over time, and I'm not saying that we eliminate the word women. Again, I use women and have used it multiple times in this video in a very specific way. But saying something like people who menstruate is a specific term to talk about the article that JK Rowling tweeted. It's just being specific. Because again, not all women menstruate, and not only women menstruate. Again, thinking of trans men or intersex people. TERFs in many cases, though, are so ready to define themselves by their uterus because they see it as their primary means of oppression. And yes, again, I acknowledge, I said this over and over again, that women who do have to fight for abortion access are oppressed because they have uteruses. But we can still fight for those rights regardless if we have a uterus or not, and it's honestly such a sad way of understanding your own womanhood as simply a tool for others to oppress you. I and many non-TERFs, cis or trans, take joy in our womanhood. I take joy in being a woman. We are all diverse and have diverse bodies and needs, trans or not. To define yourself by your oppression is honestly pitiable. We can acknowledge our oppression while still taking pride in ourselves. But TERFs don't. So TERFs' ideals, like JK has espoused, are not hurtful just to trans people, but honestly just hurtful to women in general. By being a TERF, you hurt yourself in so many ways. And to be honest, as is probably clear by my tone and the fact that my voice is getting sore, I wrote 90% of this video in anger. Anger that I even had to write this today. And I wrote this section that I'm saying right now several hours later, after I was able to analyze my anger. I mean, why am I angry when this is basically something I already knew about JK Rowling? I've done several videos on it before. It's not like I'm surprised, but at the time when I saw these tweets, I was just so upset. And it's for a couple reasons. Firstly, and as I've said before, Harry Potter is just important to me. These are books that informed my morality just as much as Star Trek did. I mean, the whole book series is about how people use meaningless distinctions to otherize human beings in an effort to justify harming them. This whole YouTube channel that I make right here, the one that you're currently on, is about discussing what fiction teaches us about how to empathize and understand other people. And the fact that JK Rowling misses the messages of her own books, and what's worse, chooses now, right now, when the world is embroiled in one of the most difficult, dangerous, and violent conversations about dehumanization in the past few decades, if not century, hurts. This is the moment in world history that she chooses to double down on hurting trans people, and women in general. I've looked up to JK Rowling my entire life for her amazing work on Harry Potter and her charity work. And the Harry Potter works helped, like I said, define my morality. It meant so much to me as a kid, and even to this day, I still listen, despite all this stuff that J.K. Rowling has said and done, I still listen to Harry Potter audiobooks as I go to sleep some nights because they comfort me and make me feel better about the world. And I often even said and considered J.K. Rowling a friend, even as I stood up to some of her more problematic views, saying, as Dumbledore said, it takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends. It is important to stand up to our friends. But you know what? At this point, and it's been a while that I've known this, J.K. Rowling, you have proven yourself to not be our friends. Steve Shives, a YouTuber who I really love, if you haven't known him before, did a really excellent video a couple days ago, talking about how people aren't just turning a blind eye to what's going on in the world right now, but looking directly at it. Whether it be the police brutality against people of color, or the rise in authoritarianism in the United States, or elsewhere, by the way, or the harm TERF ideology does to trans people. And these people look right at it and blatantly say it does not exist, that they don't see it, or that they don't care. They do this because it suits their narrative to do so, or it means that they don't have to do any hard work of looking at themselves. Internal hard work, by the way, that pales in comparison to the actual harm that they inflict by using their platform to further harm against vulnerable communities, by the way. If you would just look inside yourself for just a little bit, maybe you would understand that maybe you should just deal with that, what's in here sometimes, just a little bit, just assess yourself before actively doing something that hurts others. Or they do it because they place their party, their ability to be right, their need to be the winning side over caring for others. This all comes down to otherization. It always does. Everything I talk about on this channel is always about otherization. It always comes down to looking at another person and finding ways to say, well, they aren't like me. They aren't as human as me. Well, you know what? Screw that. We are all the same. There are inconsequential differences of skin color, gender, health, nationality, TV shows that we like. All those things are, interesting signifiers of our own individuality. But the thing that matters most is that we all feel the same. We all hope the same, and we all hurt the same. The only difference between us and people like JK Rowling is that some of us are actually trying to do the work to acknowledge that fact, to try to empathize with others' feelings, with others' pain, with others' hopes. And sometimes we don't get it right. I screw up. I'm probably screwing up in this video some way or another. I probably offended or hurt somebody, and I apologize for that. But you know what? We still try, goddammit, and we acknowledge that when we are wrong and keep trying to do better every single day. But you know what, J.K. Rowling? Apparently, you've given up. You have given up trying to learn and to be empathetic. And in many ways, that's the only way that someone can lose a piece of their humanity, a piece of their soul, to stop caring about others. So put that in your Horcrux and be done with it. This video is very angering and upsetting, so I won't spend too long on the usual rigmarole. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all those things. Help me out on Patreon if you are so willing, but I just got a lot of frustration that I needed to say, and I feel a lot better having finally put it out there. Stay safe, everybody. I wish you all well, and I hope that you, as always, no matter what, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, especially right now considering everything that's going on in the world. You keep me motivated and you help me continue doing this channel every single month. I could not do it without you. And a special thanks to my patrons, Polymena, Mystic the Monarchete, Bree Beecher, Din Hagney, Dante St. James, Anti-Cat808, Patrick Shannon, Wayne Twitchell, Wen Dizzlebizzle, Subraxis, Zach Cody, Maeve, Jason Knott, Maggie Evans, Christy Marie Johnson, Gavin Robinson, William Stewart, Michael Beam, Miranda Janelle, Mari Neckar, Lorena Mesa, Wellington Marcus, Susan Banks, Buttoneer, Ish the Mad, Ashley Allen Bociccio, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Stefan Schuhart, Greg Gillum, Christina Dalliance, Ashlyn Solstice, and Eli Bergmoss. Thank you to all of you.